thank you for the thanks to Sürdürülebilirlik Akademisi for the kind invitation. Yani konuşma daveti için teşekkür ederim ama maalesef Türkçe konuşmayacağım. Türkçe seviyem yeterince iyi değil. I'm glad to have the opportunity to start this session with a quick introduction of sustainable and low carbon cities with a focus on the role of buildings within that. Why do we talk about low carbon cities? The world uses energy use is growing exponentially, and most of this comes from fossil fuels. And with the growth of fossil fuels, so does our carbon emissions. In fact, due to exponential growth, the amount of carbon we have emitted into the atmosphere since we understood the impact of climate change, that is in the year 1992, is now more than the total emissions since the 18th century, mostly because of that exponential growth. And if we do not limit our carbon emissions, the growth of our carbon emissions, we will end up with dangerous climate change. There is now an increasing number of pledges and targets from different countries to cut back their carbon emissions, but unless the world delivers on these promises and reduces emissions drastically, we will not be able to limit climate change to 1.5 or 2 degrees as we need to. To meet 1.5 to 2 degrees of climate change leaves us with very limited carbon budget. It requires us to cut carbon emissions in half every decade. And this is just to give you a sense of how much the reduction that is. This is equivalent to reducing the reduction in carbon emissions that is equivalent to the impact of COVID-19, like a pandemic like COVID-19 every 2 years. So if you can imagine that. And the later we delay cutting those emissions, it makes it harder for us to make a more steeper cut and avoid dangerous climate change if we want to keep it to 2 degrees. And if we want to keep it to 1.5 degrees, then we really have no time to waste at all. At national level, 8 countries so far have created laws, and 6 are in the process of doing so to commit themselves to becoming zero carbon nationally by 2050 or even before that. And 18 countries have published policy papers. Many more are already considering developing similar policies. But unfortunately, there is no commitment from Turkey yet. Cities are quite central to this. They cover just 3% of land area, but they use more than 2/3 of energy use and emit responsible for the emission of 70% of carbon emissions. Already many cities are committing to very serious climate action. 84 cities, including London, Zurich, Kyoto, and Osaka, are all committed to net zero carbon by 2050 or before that. And hundreds more have committed to climate action and low carbon development, and that includes 8 Turkish cities which are already registered under the UNFCCC's recognition of active cities carrying out climate action within their municipalities. But what is a zero carbon city anyways, and what is a low carbon city? And zero carbon city is this concept that a city, or we could sometimes refer to as carbon neutral, that a city that has an operation, or the way it runs, does not result in an increase in carbon emissions. A low carbon city, on the other hand, is a city that reduces its carbon emissions, but this varies by the amount of reduction. It also varies by the comparison you're making, the baseline case that you're comparing to. And net zero carbon and low carbon cities are much easier to do in cities that already have a low carbon emissions. So these cities are like cities, for example, that get their energy from renewable energy sources. There are more than 40 cities that get 100% of their energy from renewable energy sources, including hydro, mostly hydro actually. Cities with a higher density, they tend to be more energy efficient, therefore use less carbon. Cities with good public transportation networks, again, that's more energy efficient, so they emit less carbon. And also cities with a building stock that is energy efficient as it stands. This varies from one country to the other. Cities such as London, where I live, is a good example. It's committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2050, also wants to have zero carbon transportation, wants to have zero waste, and a host of other environmental targets, all by 2050. That they want to reduce that to 60% within 9 years, 80% within 19 years, and ultimately by 2050 to zero. And within cities, buildings are quite important if cities want to reduce their carbon emissions. In the UK, again, where I live, most carbon emissions come from the built environment are attributed to operating existing cities. And this is a diagram I did a few years ago to assess the amount of carbon. And most of it you'll see from the big bubbles there come from operating existing residential and non-residential buildings. This includes carbon emitted due to operating the buildings and also embodied carbon within the buildings themselves. The way The embodied carbon basically is the carbon that is emitted during the manufacturing of building materials and also during the construction of buildings. How the buildings were put together has a carbon footprint, and that's also critical to the impact of buildings on cities. In the UK, operating buildings alone accounts for 19%. That's not including the embodied carbon. 90% of total emissions in the UK. In Turkey, this is roughly the same figure, it's 18.4%, but in Turkey, the buildings are responsible for a much higher share of energy use, around 33% back in 2015, the statistics comes from. Some cities are more pioneering on the buildings front. 20 cities have signed up to the Zero Carbon Buildings Declaration, which is an initiative by the World Green Building Council, but is also supported by the Carbon Leadership Group known as C40, the Climate Leadership Group, rather, known as C40. And these lists are cities that have committed to ensuring that all new buildings operate at net zero carbon. So this is about operation of building at net zero carbon by 2030. So imagine within 9 years, every new building that is built in any of these cities will have to basically result in zero extra carbon, and every existing building emits zero carbon by 2050. So the entire stock of the building itself. And in certain cities, this is quite a meaningful thing to do, a more impactful thing to do to achieve the carbon targets. In the case of London, retrofitting existing buildings, you see on the very right-hand side here, is deemed to have the most impact, especially that the average building stock in the UK has a very low energy efficiency. So retrofitting existing buildings has the highest impact on reducing carbon emissions. The average efficiency for a building in the UK is EPC Class D or Level D, so Environmental Performance Certificate Level D. Designing and building new buildings in the UK has a significant impact as well. You find in the middle of this diagram, not quite the highest impact, but quite a high one. In Turkey, however, the situation is different. The energy efficiency strategy calls for transforming at least a quarter of the building stock to energy efficient by 2023. I don't know what the progress has been on this, but the new buildings play a bigger role in Turkey than they do in some European countries, definitely more than the UK, because in Turkey you have 100,000 new buildings roughly being added to the building stock every year, and depending on how energy efficient they are, they play a much bigger role than does new buildings, which are much smaller in numbers in Europe. In addition, the Kentsel Dönüşüm urban transformation plan, they have planned to build 7.5 million dwellings by 2030. That's a third of the building stock. So that creates an opportunity for not the entire building stock, just the residential building stock. That creates an opportunity to improve energy efficiency in new buildings more than it does again in Europe. The energy efficiency strategy also calls for integrating sustainability into building permits, requires energy efficiency of EPC level D, even aiming to reach level B as well. But if such standard is raised beyond this into net zero carbon, for example, the international best practice today, the Turkish energy efficiency target, which is 14% within 2 or 3 years, according to its National Energy Efficiency Action Plan, this could be exceeded, and the country could end up with significantly more benefits for energy security and also for carbon emissions. But what is a net zero building? There are multiple definitions of what a net zero building is. There are zero energy buildings, nearly zero energy buildings, net zero carbon buildings. So I'll briefly go through the definitions. Hopefully, it won't be too boring, and also as well as the applications of these definitions as well. So a zero carbon building is a zero energy building is an energy efficient building. It's connected to the grid, and it generates enough energy from its own renewable sources to compensate for its own energy use. So it requires, over a course of a year, requires no additional energy coming in from the grid, but it is grid connected. A nearly zero energy building is also grid connected. It's very high in performance in terms of its own energy efficiency, and it sources a significant amount of energy from renewable energy sources, not entirely fully dependent on its own renewables on site, but it tends to get quite close to that. And this is the definition that is adopted by the EU's directive known as the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. This directive has been mandatory since January this year, but it is quite a flexible directive. The different countries had an opportunity to define what the meaning of very high energy performance means. So every country, and they varied wildly. Austria has a much higher energy efficiency, much lower energy efficiency than anyone would expect. For example, but other countries have a higher one. In the UK, when it left the EU, it got to define what very high energy performance very differently from there. It kept the law, but it defined it as basically current building regulations did not increase that beyond this at this point. But there are other voluntary codes that have emerged over the years for near zero energy buildings. These include LEED has a code known as zero energy. Again, these are all voluntary. Living Building Challenge has a zero energy certification. There's a zero code, which is again voluntary in the US, and it's being attempted to be integrated into residential buildings. Another standard that we are familiar with is net zero carbon buildings. So that's compared to net zero or nearly zero energy buildings. We're only focusing on carbon here. Net zero carbon building is one that complies with two components. One, it reduces the carbon associated with its own operations. So that's known as operational emissions. And it reduces the emissions associated with the material production and the construction of the building itself. And that's known as embodied carbon. That can also include some offsets because it's very hard to get the materials that you build the building from to have zero footprint. So these two components together are known as the whole life carbon of a building. The goal is to bring these two down by all measures possible down to zero. There are voluntary codes for net zero carbon buildings. The LEED zero carbon, separate from the other LEED one, does not include embodied carbon, but bizarrely includes transportation to and from the building. And there's another version of the zero code which only applies to California, but again, it's still voluntary and hasn't been fully adopted as a requirement over there. So how do we create a net zero carbon building? To achieve a net zero carbon building, we have to reduce both components, the operational carbon and the embodied carbon. And whatever emissions we have left, then they need to be offset by a renewable energy or by carbon sequestration. And by carbon sequestration here, I mean tree planting, basically, because trees have the same capability to pull carbon out of the atmosphere.
Thank you.